Hi and welcome to my channel, or welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. This is a sci-fi novel, but it's not your typical sci-fi novel. It pushes the boundaries of what a sci-fi novel is. There are some parts in the book that are quite surrealistic, and people say that it reminds them of Cloud Atlas, which I haven't read, so I don't really know about that. But basically, this is a collection of short stories, and there is always a small time jump between each story. This book starts off with a scientist that goes to Siberia to continue a research of his daughter that passed away, and in the ice that has melted because of climate change, he discovers a body of a little girl that is infected with some mysterious virus. This is definitely not a far-fetched concept because, as we know, there have been multiple viruses discovered in the permafrost already, and there's this very real fear that perhaps one day we will discover a virus that our bodies will not know how to deal with, and there will be a pandemic. So this book deals with climate change, pandemic, but most importantly, death in some shape or form, or grieving. It is a very sad and depressing book, so you really have to be in a good mind space to read it. I have listened to this book as an audiobook on script, and I don't know if I would really recommend it to others because there are so many little details that you can miss if you're someone like me who likes to perhaps do chores and focus on other stuff when I'm listening to the audiobook. I feel like picking up the physical copy would have been a better idea because still I feel like I've missed so many little details, or perhaps how some of the stories were connected. Regardless, this is a very good book. I would recommend it to anyone. However, like I said, it deals with a pandemic, and perhaps it might be too soon for you to read a book about one, but also try not to compare it with the pandemic that we have experienced, I would say. Okay, that will be it for the spoiler-free section. Now I will dive into the discussion and talk about each story and also each concept that I found interesting. So if you haven't read this book, probably you shouldn't continue. Let's talk about the book itself and what I liked about it with spoilers and what I perhaps didn't like. I really hate to do this, but I feel like I have to talk about the ending and the last story first because that just blew my mind and it creeped me out so much, as we have learned that there's been this millions of years old alien just roaming the earth, pretending to be human. And as soon as we got to that part where she was talking about being a Neanderthal, I was thinking, okay, she was definitely Clara and she just wanted to see her daughter for the last time. Or perhaps prevent the pandemic. I feel like perhaps she wanted to do that, but she realized it was too late. And so she faked her death and kind of let the body there just infect others. I don't really know what her thought process was there, because she wanted to fix it, but she didn't really end up fixing it. I'm just going to assume that it was too late for her to do anything, that everybody else was just infected already with this virus. And then also she was being Theresa, and just something about that just creeps me out. This idea that Earth can be just some sort of project of a bored alien, it's just stuff straight out of my nightmares. Okay, let's move on. Now I will go in the chronological order. So we started off with the story 30,000 Years Beneath Eulogy, and I went into this book not knowing what it's about at all. So I have assumed that this is just sort of a cute book about scientists being in Siberia and just discovering this body and what are they going to do with it. And then the second story came, which was City of Laughter, and that story hit me like a ton of bricks. This idea of having a euthanasia roller coaster specifically designed for children was just so shocking and sad. But what I found hard to believe is that this was just right after the pandemic kind of started, but because it deals with euthanasia and children and ethics behind it, I found that hard to believe that this would be something introduced like few years into the pandemic, because at this point it was only affecting children, and so people created this to ease the pain of the children, which is a really noble cause. I just don't really think that this could be something that would realistically happen just a few years in the pandemic. Like, for example, after, let's say, 6 years of having children dying this way, that's when I would think that something like this would be made. But still, very interesting concept regardless, and absolutely heartbreaking story, as all stories are in this book actually. Then we get to Through the Garden of Memory, and this was definitely surprising to me. I did not expect such story in this book, because it deals with afterlife, or I guess it was a state between a life and death, and there are people just reliving their past lives and being happy, and also they want to go back because they're worried about their loved ones but they can't, and then these people create a pyramid, and in the end they sent off a baby somewhere. And in the story we don't really know what happened to the baby, but we actually learned that the baby became a grandmother of one of the main characters in the later stories. Because it was so surrealistic, I didn't really know how to feel about it. It was definitely an interesting concept. We also learned that How High We Go in the Dark has actually quite a literal meaning, and I wonder if perhaps they have sent off more people, and how do you choose people that should be brought back to life? I wish that this concept was explored more in perhaps a different story, but let's move on. So then we get to the story Pig Son, and I didn't really, again, know how to feel about this story, because this is the story with the researcher and a pig that suddenly grows a large brain and can talk and becomes quite intelligent. I have quickly grown attached to the character of the pig. I think his name was Snotorius. I really liked Snotorius, but this story was depressing and heartbreaking just for the sake of it, I feel like. Because the only options were that he's either going to die and donate his organs, or he will have a life of terrible experiments done on him, and eventually he's going to die anyway because his brain would be too large. And at first I was really mad about the ending, because I felt that it was pointless, because Notorious donated organs to some kids that are going to die anyway. I feel like at this point even I became desensitized to children dying in the novel. But I wish this was one of the stories where we got a bit more hopeful ending. I don't know how you feel about the story. Do you agree with me? Do you not? I would go even further in this concept, and I would, instead of pigs, have them raise human clones that essentially wouldn't be intelligent, they wouldn't be able to talk, and then they would start gaining consciousness, and where the ethics of that would be. That would be even creepier, I feel like, but okay, next story. Elegy Hotel presents a very interesting concept of having funeral hotels where you can enjoy your last moments with your deceased loved ones. This is another concept where I felt like you would have to be even perhaps decades into the pandemic already to be so desensitized to death. Regardless, I really enjoyed the portrayal of how capitalism surrounding death blossomed, and then later on it has turned into something else completely. Speak, Fetch, Say I Love You deals with robotic dogs that have stored memories of the loved ones. If you think that this concept is too far-fetched, it's not. Robotic dogs actually exist, and I believe that even the author has one now. The main character tried to fix these robotic dogs and at least give some hope to the people that were grieving their loved ones. I feel like at least this person was trying to do good. You might disagree with me. I don't know if lying to people and pretending that their dog is fixed just to make them happy is very ethical, but I found this story to be strangely heartwarming. Songs of Your Decay is a story about a woman falling in love with her test subject, you could say. I couldn't connect with the main character at all. I think that she was quite unlikable. This was another heartbreaking story, but what I liked about it is how she connected with the sister of the deceased person, and perhaps she would make a new friend out of that absolutely awful experience. And I found this story to be very realistic. Life around the event horizon introduces a scientist that has a black hole planted into his brain, and his wife, Theresa. I don't even want to talk about her now. The scientist knows that at some point the black hole will kill him, and I wish that perhaps in the book we would have some fractured memories written. That would make it more realistic and depressing. And why am I thinking about ideas how to make this book even more sad and depressing? I don't know. But okay, let's move on. A Gallery, a Century, Cry a Millennium is a story about Yumi, which was Clara's daughter, who is part alien. Isn't that wonderful? And Miko, was it? Who was the wife of the scientist that went to Siberia. Something that didn't really make sense to me was how reasonable everybody around these two were. Because as we know, when the pandemic started, a lot of people were attacking Asians just for simply existing, right? Because they somehow believe that they have the virus. I'm actually really surprised that, like, perhaps the neighbors didn't really try to put blame on the relatives, because in real life people are not as reasonable as in this novel. I would actually think that this would add more depth to the story and make it even more realistic. Miko and Yumi board this ship that is supposed to travel through space and find some planets where there could be a human civilization. I'm not going to lie, this story made me incredibly claustrophobic. I really don't like the concept of people being stuck in the middle of the universe and trying to find land. And the main reason for that was because of the pandemic, because people felt like that the life on Earth is doomed. And then I think the vaccine was actually discovered 10 years later after the pandemic started. We also have learned that they have traveled for 6,000 years. I cannot remember if it was 6,000 years or 6,000 light years. And perhaps we could get a message that the Earth as we know it stopped existing, that perhaps the climate change just got too bad, perhaps humanity was wiped out over something, but the signal cuts off, so we don't really know what is happening to Earth anymore. I wonder if Yumi, who is part alien, would discover her alien heritage. She would discover the OG creators of everything. Just thinking about that makes my skin crawl, so let's move on. The Used to Be Party is a letter of a lonely man writing a letter to his neighbors, trying to find a connection again and struggling with making friends after the pandemic. And I found this story to be so incredibly relatable. I know that people don't like to talk about this, but I'm also one of those people that have struggled quite a lot after the pandemic. I am heavily introverted and I struggled to make connection all my life, and then finally in 2019 I started to come out of my shell and make new friends, and then the pandemic hit, and honestly I haven't recovered fully from it till now, and I really enjoyed that we got to experience just the aftermath of the pandemic and the real effects something like that has on people. Melancholy Nights in a Tokyo Virtual Cafe felt like a Black Mirror episode. At this point we are way further into the future and the virtual reality has a presence in everyday life. We get to meet a character that struggled to finish his education during the pandemic and now he's struggling to find a job, and he meets this single mother of a child whose vaccine didn't really work and the child is still in terrible pain. And I really appreciated this because till this point it felt very much like, oh, here's the vaccine, everything is perfect again, everyone is cured, but that wasn't the case, and the ending of the story was as well so incredibly depressing and sad, and oh gosh, this was one of the most hard-hitting stories, I feel like, out of the entire book. I liked how people were making avatars and they were meeting people in forums, which also happens now as well, but this was brought to a completely new level. Before You Melt into the Sea is the only story written in second person, and it was so creepy. The main character that is narrating it felt a little bit like a stalker. This story made everything seem so real because it felt like we are the ones who died. We have also learned about different ways how to cremate a body and how people got more creative when it came to cremating or liquefying a body. Grave Friends. This is a story where we have learned that the baby that previously was sent very high into the dark was actually the grandmother of the main character, and the grandmother already passed away. I think at this point it was the year 2135, and also Japan has basically turned into very small islands because the sea levels got too high. Personally, this story wasn't really my favorite. I didn't really know how to feel about a family member trying to escape and have a better life, and then sort of reflecting on that and perhaps thinking of returning to somewhere where they weren't happy in the first place. But that could be just my opinion, of course. And then we've got to the final story that I already talked about. That story just... that was something, okay? Let's not talk about the last story anymore. So that will be it for this discussion. I know I talked a lot about stuff that perhaps I didn't like, or stuff that I would like to see in the book, or ideas that could be explored more. But overall, I really enjoyed this book, and I kind of want to go back and reread it or re-listen to it, because I feel like I've missed so many little details just because I was listening to the audiobook and sometimes not exactly paying as much attention as I should have. I know sometimes I wasn't even talking about how differently the stories were connected. That's not because I was completely oblivious to it. I was still paying some attention, okay? I just felt like it was pointless to mention, but I've noticed in some discussions that people missed the connection between the baby and what really happened to the baby in the memory garden. If you're wondering about the rating, I gave it 4.25 stars. I use Storygraph now, that has quarter stars. Let me know if you have agreed with some of my opinions or if you have disagreed. What are your thoughts about this book? Because I feel like each person can pull something else from the book. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.